All right, hi everybody. I am back with my guest today, Melissa Korn, who wrote this book, Unacceptable, which we have been talking about, and it's all about the Varsity Blues scandal. And actually, in the second segment, what I really want to do is get a little bit more into the guy at the center of it all, who does, in theory, sorry, he doesn't do this anymore because he's going to jail, what I do on a very, very like I even hate to, say that we're anything alike because we're really not. In name only, we did the same thing, and that's Rick Singer.
And he did not belong to any of the professional organizations that have, ethics standards. He was not part of any of those groups. So yes, he was a college counselor, but not in kind of the mainstream of college counseling.
Exactly. He certainly is someone who's given the profession a very bad name. I have a bunch of things that I would love to point to about Rick Singer. And for me, the overwhelming sense since the beginning has always been, what were these parents thinking? You could tell this guy is a shyster from the second he opens his mouth. I'm amazed that these people were okay with him working with their children. And so I'm curious about your take. And have you been in the room with him when the trials were going on? Yes or
Well, he
no?
hasn't been.
That's true. Yeah.
Jennifer was there when he pleaded guilty. She was there in person, but he hasn't been in court since, really.
Okay. So
So he's still
yeah,
he's still out. He'll be sentenced after everyone else.
yeah, that will be very interesting to see what he gets,
Yes, it
right?
will. Yeah.
So what's your take on our pal Rick Singer?
Rick's a really fascinating character. So he grew up kind of lower middle class in more a slightly more affluent neighborhood and had this chip on his shoulder. And from the start, he was very competitive and always exaggerated.
Yes.
Perhaps that's an exaggeration to say always, but often exaggerated.
Yes.
And that was just part of who he was, and people liked him. He was affable, he was pretty popular. He did not have a very straight path through college. He knocked around to a few different schools. He was in his mid-20s by the time he graduated. So he did not have that very fancy pedigree that many of his clients did. He worked as a basketball coach at junior college and then at Cal State and at a high school. And he got to see the athletic recruiting process up close. And I think that was part of what helped him in this process. He also was really good at relating to kids, especially the young men. He would challenge them to a push-up contest. He would just kind of wouldn't take nonsense from them. And
Right.
he'd be able to tell them things that mom and dad would try, but the kid wouldn't listen. And somehow it worked when Rick told them to do it. You got to buckle down, you got to work harder. He also had quite a bit of knowledge about schools, and this was before you could just Google a campus, right? This was
Yes.
back in the early 90s, and the mid 90s. He had pamphlets, he had books, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of a lot of these schools, so he really could help some of these families, especially in the early periods, um, navigate the process and narrow their list down and all of that. uh, I think one of the things that some parents liked about him was that he offered to make it really easy. He offered to
Yes.
take care of this problem, that college admissions is a hassle, it is a stressful experience for everyone in the family. Rick's just going to make it simpler, calmer, and faster.
Right. He's kind of going
And
to make it go away almost for
to
the
make the problem go
parents.
away.
Right,
Yes.
right.
And that was really appealing for some parents. There were some parents who, if they had not been to college, right, you'd want someone to help guide you through it. And even those who did go to college, it's a lot different now than it was when they were going in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
So they were kind of shocked to hear how hard it was to get into certain schools. That said, Rick sometimes played up just
Yes.
how hard it was at some of these. Well, it was really fascinating, kind of the psychology of how he figured out which clients would go over that line to the illegal stuff. Some reached out to him because of that. They knew he was working this scheme and, hey, I want in. Others started with very innocent, test prep or tutoring or things like that, and then kind of
Right.
slowly walked their way over. And Singer was really good at reading people. So he saw that they had their insecurities as parents, or am I doing this right? I want to keep up with the Joneses. I can't disappoint my kid. All that stuff.
Yes. Some of
So
it eye rolling. I think I just rolled my eyes
yeah,
involuntarily, but yes, exactly.
yeah. And he would, so people ask when this all started, and the federal criminal case mostly goes back to about 2011. There's a reference to one situation in 2008, but nobody was charged with that. It was an older sibling of, a couple of the kids whose deals were detailed. So we put it back to at least 2008 for
Mhm.
this particular scheme, but we know that he was doing some shady stuff well before then. And I think as you learn more about those kind of smaller lies that he would encourage people to tell, then you see how it builds up to this wholesale, like, sure, I'll pretend my kid's, a coxswain on the route on the crew team.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I think for me, a couple of the key things, I think about this from the perspective of how do you avoid the Rick Singers in your future? To me, it seemed like he might as well have hung out a neon sign that said, please don't let me alone with your children and don't work with me. I am, not a good guy, right? But clearly people did not see it that way. So let me give
To be
you,
clear, there's no safety issues involved in him being left alone with the team. But
sure.
I know what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. More just, is this really someone you want interacting with your child? And I think things like a good counselor is never going to ratchet up the anxiety and then hit you with but I'm going to solve that problem. A good counselor is right from the get go going to say, my role here is to try and make this process easier. It's trying to, but not by first sort of saying it's so hard and you can't do this unless you have me. That is a red flag. Any kind of lying or fibbing to make something appear better, bad. Yeah.
Yes, so there were a bunch of those over the years. Some of the more surprising or tend to be horrifying ones. Him encouraging people to check off a race or ethnicity that they were not.
Yes.
Schools don't check. Schools don't verify. They're not going to say, "Please send me a DNA sample. Please send me your some, uh, you know, please send me your tribal card. Please send me a photo of yourself." Like, they're not going to ask. That just opens way too many dangerous legal doors.
Yes.
But so if you mark off that you're something, they're going to believe you. Uh, so Rick would kind of, knowing that certain schools were really working hard to diversify their student populations, he encouraged students to check off that they were Hispanic or Latino, that they were first generation college students rather than actually legacies at that particular school.
Yeah. Bad.
Um, kind of weighing like, okay, which one is going to give me more of an edge? Saying nobody in my family went to college or my dad went here.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of exaggerations, going from I did this one program to I led this huge initiative. He was really big on having kids kind of build their brands, which I
Right.
think is another red flag, because you want to be applying to a school that will be a good fit for your authentic self, right? Not for this packaged fake version of yourself that you're pitching. And if you don't actually care about building houses or music or whatever the brand is that you've decided to do, that's probably not the right school for you.
Well, there's absolutely, and we could probably do an entire other show around that. It's so true, but certainly, I have to completely agree with that idea. The goal really is you put your best foot forward in that application, not some fake person's best foot forward. We talk all the time about the importance of authenticity because if you're not your authentic self, it does nobody any good, not the colleges that are reading your application, nor you when you get to any college that you get into with this inauthentic person. Other red flags for me included some of the bigger ones, right? Writing your essay. If you are hiring someone and one of the things they're going to do for you is write your essay, you are not maybe at the level where you're going to wind up in jail, but that is not cool. That's cheating.
There's a very big difference between having an adult read over an essay, having somebody help brainstorm ideas, having somebody maybe read through for typos or grammar, because you want to send, a polished piece of your work, but
Yes.
ultimately it should be your work.
Yes.
And there are a few examples in the book, a kid in a very fancy
Yes.
house writing about his growing up in poverty and how hard that was. And he had like a pool with a water slide in the back. And
Yeah, it strains credulity. I mean, yes, they're going to these fancy private schools and you could be a scholarship student there, but then when you also look at the address and I mean,
zip
on some
code.
level, you kind of do have to take them a little bit at their word, but it is shocking to me a little bit that some of this didn't raise more
Yes.
eyebrows.
And there were throughout the whole scheme, there were a few times that guidance counselor, the college counselors at high
Yes.
school did try to raise some red flags and say something seems a little fishy here. This seems a little off. And for a variety of reasons, it just didn't go anywhere. The complaints, the concerns got shut down, whether it was by the high school, by other people at the high school. USC one point, there were kind of some questions around a few athletic admits. The person who was put in charge of
Yeah.
reviewing that, investigating, was Donna Heinel, who's been charged in the scheme.
Yes. And they put her in charge of it. I love that. And I actually had a little post-it note on that. I'm like, well, that's just brilliant.
Yes.
And actually, I do the one of the things that was most jaw-dropping for me and made me feel so school counselors in this country have really difficult jobs, especially at public schools, also at private schools, but really at public schools.
And
And in
the
his
ratios, people don't quite realize just
yes.
how awful these ratios are, right? You've got one guidance counselor or counselor for
Mhm.
3, 4, 500 students. And that's not just college counseling for most of them. It's
No.
general, course selection, mental health issues, everything.
Is everything. And when in the early days, he was doing things like going into the schools and sitting in on counselor meetings, and the parents were foisting him on them. That is just so awful to
Mhm.
me because I view my role as supporting this, what the school counselors are doing, and obviously supporting the student and the parents. But I would never ever dream of going in and saying something like that. I will raise things with kids and say, "Hey, have you thought about taking this class?" That's a conversation you should have. And if they come back and say, "My school says no, and here's why," okay, great. Then no, that's the answer. And he says things like, "You tell them you're taking it and they have no idea what they're talking about." That to me is, if you have a counselor that you've hired and that's how they talk about your school counseling staff, that is also a red flag for me.
Right. And
Yeah.
every school has different policies about how or if they'll even engage with the independent counselor.
Yes.
But it certainly should not be an antagonistic relationship or one in which one party is trying to hide something from the other.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Like if the private counselor, the independent counselor doesn't want the school to know that you're applying to a particular school or what your essay looks like, big red flags there. Like,
Yeah, I
trying to hide
agree.
something.
Yeah. The fact that he was also submitting essays for families, also a no, complete and total no-no.
You
You,
have to press submit
yes, you
yourself.
really do.
The
I
kid
mean,
has to.
even when we were still having students come into our offices, I wouldn't even, there would be times where you just have a kid who is so stressed about it that they might literally sit in your office while they press submit,
Yeah.
but never, ever, ever do we
Right.
want to be in a position of pressing submit. And the fact that he was just taking wholesale and I will get these in for you, so bad,
I mean,
such a
some of these
bad.
families didn't know the logins for the Common App because they
Yes.
had never even logged in because he just did it all.
Yeah. Now,
He had a team who helped.
yeah, and I think that's another thing, right? If you're completely, if this is your student's college process and you're just saying, "Hey, this guy's going to do the whole thing for you," and that's, I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many bad messages being sent to children over this, but to me, that's a big one.
And I think the college application process is a really good learning experience for teens, right?
Yes.
Trying to distill a bit of who you are, trying to identify who you are as you're applying and deciding what schools to apply to and writing your essays, that's all really valuable. Looking at your extracurriculars list and saying, oh wow, there is a theme that goes through all this, or there's not, and I've just tried a lot of really awesome things, and that shows that I can pick up things quickly. Like there are lessons in all that, just like there's valuable lessons in being rejected.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I did not get into my first choice school and I was devastated, but I have since survived. And it was all for the best. And in the moment, it doesn't feel that way, of course, but those are all good learning experiences in kind of preparing for adulthood.
Well, and I would like to know, who is the adult who has sailed through life without encountering anything negative, ever hearing no. And for many of these students, it will be the first time they've heard no. And when I worked at Penn, you would get calls from people who heard no and really didn't like it. And I didn't get that stressed about those calls because that was my attitude. These are people who are going to be fine.
Yes.
They're going to wind up somewhere, and they're probably going to wind up somewhere really good. And I'm just not going to worry about it that much. And, I bet there are plenty of people who dreamed about going to Penn, didn't get in, and then went somewhere else and are thinking, I can't imagine that I would have gone anywhere else. And, life. All right. So that we don't run out of time, let's talk about the aftermath of all of this. I've seen a few interesting changes. I'm curious from your end, what you see as changes that were made or maybe not made as a result of this.
All right, so the final chapter of the book is titled "A System Reformed?" question mark.
Yes.
So that probably gives a little hint of where I land on this question. I am surprised by how little schools have set out to change since the scandal.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen some major changes in college admissions in the process, but that was a result of the pandemic, not this cheating fraud case. So right when this scandal broke, the College Board and the ACT said, these were just a few bad apples. Like, our tests are very secure. We're cool. Like, don't worry about it. We got this. We're not making any further changes. A bunch of colleges said, we're the victims here. This wasn't our fault. And a bunch of college counselors, a bunch of admissions officers and college counselors actually said, none of us were charged, right? Like, our groups weren't involved. This was not an admissions scandal.
Right.
And there's a scene in the book of me at a conference of admissions counselors and college counselors, admissions officers and college counselors, just with that refrain over and over for like 4 days. And it was astonishing. It was a sports scandal. It was a testing scandal, but this was not an admissions scandal. Don't blame admissions offices. Like, well, but it is the practices, and it is the ways in which schools have set up admissions and development and the relationship between those two offices, right? Fundraising and admissions. There's always going to be some questionable behavior as long as those offices have any interaction with each other.
Right.
So haven't seen that much change there. There's certain rules were put in place at some schools in terms of the timing of gifts or who has to sign off on a gift. They're not saying no to the gifts. It's just
they're not. Yeah, interestingly enough, one thing we help people in a variety of ways, one of which is free, right? We do these podcasts, they're free. We write a blog, that's free. We post 5 times a week on that. We also work with many people through their employers. So their employer sponsors the benefit and we help them. But we do have a small group of people that we work with in a very traditional independent counseling. And we do have amongst those families some who have development ties at schools. One interesting thing that we are seeing, and that my colleagues in this world are also seeing, not here at College Coach, is that the development piece had less of an impact this year, and development ties that I was sure would come through because they absolutely would have in the past did not. And that has been an interesting development for me.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that is individual kind of concern and focus on optics and just this is right and wrong versus firm policies by the schools.
Yeah.
I think we need a few more cycles to really see that.
Yeah.
Same with admissions offices verifying applications, doing some audits. Some schools have said, okay, we'll call around and check the facts of a few more of these. And if a kid got in as a recruited athlete, we'll make sure that they actually are on the roster of the team, because apparently before schools did not do that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
So, all in all, that stuff, I haven't seen really significant change. And I don't know that there will be on that front. I don't know that schools owned the problem enough to really see it as theirs to fix. I think a lot of high schools, especially some independent, pricey high schools, have said, we need to change our messaging here. Like, we helped cause this in a way.
Yeah.
And good on them for owning that and kind of working to take it down a few notches in terms of the anxiety around college admissions. uh, if there's some, amusement that I can get from if some of these families had just waited 1 or 2 years, they wouldn't have had to do the testing thing,
I
right?
know.
Tests
It's
went optional.
classic. I know. I know it. So,
So, you know, it's it's changed, but not because of the scandal. So I think as more schools get test optional, there will always be someone trying to find an edge, trying to get an easy in. And as long as schools are looking at any measures and it's not just a totally blind lottery, people will find a way to try to game that system.
yeah, yes, full stop. One interesting piece in the aftermath that I have seen, which has been really fascinating and actually kind of disturbing, is how many more people are trying to be in this space with no experience. So you talk about that a little bit, just that, there are people. So on my team, everybody is a former admissions officer. We're a member of NACAC. Every member of my team is a member of NACAC. There are professional organizations that people can join. It's not a foolproof way to identify who's good and who's not, but
Right.
when you hang your shingle out and your only claim to fame is that you went to that school,
Yes. And there
it's
are a lot of
tricky.
those.
A lot.
A lot of, I went to Harvard, I can help get you in, or a
Yes.
lot of my son got into Princeton, therefore I have mastered the system, let me help you.
Right. When in truth, they don't have no idea why the kid got into Princeton. They think they
Right.
know, but they don't necessarily know. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Like you want somebody who's been intimately involved in the process as an admissions officer. They understand how it works, whether it's at the particular, your
Yes.
top target school or another.
Yes.
There's still just a base knowledge that you get from being in those offices, in those rooms, in those discussions, that unless you've been there, you can make some guesses and some pretty educated guesses, but you're
Right.
just not going to know.
Still a guess, exactly. And there was something that came up that well, I think another thing is just you have to be careful about guarantees and promises, and that's something that Rick did a lot of, right? That's what these people loved, the idea that it was a guarantee, or he'd come in and say, "I know 5 other people have told you this isn't going to happen." And this is why they're saying it, but I'll tell you it can happen and here's how. You gotta watch out for shopping around until someone tells you what you want to hear.
I will say that it's very common practice for families in China to have a pay structure with their independent counselors where it's a small payment up front, and you're not guaranteed admission to a particular school, but it's if you get into this tier of schools or this list of 5 schools, then you pay this amount. If you get into this list, you pay a smaller amount, less prestigious schools, things like that. And it's not fully a guarantee, but it's we don't get our money unless you get into one of these
Right.
schools, the balloon payment at the end. There was actually just a federal case, charges against some people in California who had that set up. And
Yes.
from what I can tell, the only real difference was they were doing it on US soil.
Right. And I think in that situation we might be conflating too. They were creating everything out of thin air for these kids,
Yes, yes.
fabricating
We can
their
say that happens in many parts of the world, but
yeah,
yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah. And what drives me bonkers about those, or conversely, where you pay a huge sum of money and then you get some of it back if you don't get in, is that every time I read that, I think that kid was getting into those schools anyway.
Right.
It's on some level masterful, and on another level just so egregious, and it feels so icky. We have only like 1 minute. One final thought from you on all of this, and just as a reminder, the book is Unacceptable, and you can get it on Amazon or anywhere where you buy books. Final thought from you on this whole thing.
I tend to be pretty cynical, and I have to admit that this covering the scandal for the past 2 years and knowing I'll be covering it at least through the fall with the trials has not helped me become more, positive and trusting or anything like that. But it also has made me realize that there are a lot of people who could help fix things. And there are a lot of really good ideas out there to fix things. The big step of so many schools going test optional, at least for now, I think that's going to be really hard to undo that at a lot of these
I agree.
schools.
It is. Yeah.
So this could be a much longer term wholesale change. I think there are still opportunities for change, but I don't know who it's going to be to really kind of get that off the ground. If this didn't spark it, then
Then
I don't know
what
what
will?
will.
I
Yeah.
know. Melissa, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, next week, Sally is here. She is going to be talking about summer planning, career coaching for teens, and we're going to be taking a look at higher ed finance legislation and updates on that. So don't forget, we are here every Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.